A rainy night. A stranger stranded on the road. David Wagner was an ordinary mechanic, but the kindness he showed that night would pull him into a world he never could have imagined. Power, secrets, and unexpected connections. Was it all just a coincidence, or was it the hidden hand of fate? Some encounters change a life forever. David Wagner was an honest and hardworking man who worked in his old but reliable garage in the middle of a small town. He had lost his family at a young age, and the only person who raised him was his selfless and loving aunt, Margarethe. Margarethe was one of the sweetest people in town. Despite being old, her energy never seemed to run out, and she loved making her neighbors happy with the smells of cinnamon and apples coming from her oven. She wasn't just David's aunt. She was his family, his best friend, and the most precious person in his life. David was a man who didn't have big expectations from life and knew how to be happy with what he had. He worked from morning till evening in his garage, and after his long days surrounded by the sounds of engines and the smell of oil, he would come home to enjoy the warm meals his aunt had cooked. Listening to the old stories Margarethe told was one of the most peaceful moments of his day. However, despite their happiness, their financial situation was not looking great. The potential customer base in the town was limited, and David could only earn enough to cover the bills and daily expenses. Dreaming of something bigger seemed almost impossible. Still, David sometimes let himself drift into dreams. He imagined taking his aunt on a beautiful vacation, doing everything he could to give her a better life. Maybe one day, maybe if a miracle happened. But he never thought anything would happen to change his life. Not until that rainy night. That night, as David drove home from work, the sky took a sudden turn. What had been a calm evening quickly darkened as heavy clouds rolled in, blotting out the last traces of daylight. Within moments, the first fat raindrops splattered against his windshield, followed by a torrential downpour. The rhythmic thud of the wipers struggled to keep up, streaking water across the glass as he navigated the nearly deserted road, the glow of his headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Just ahead, something unusual caught his attention. A sleek luxury car parked by the roadside, its glossy surface slick with rain. At first glance, it seemed abandoned, but then he saw her. A young woman stood beside it, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she shivered in the cold. Her thin jacket was no match for the relentless storm, and her drenched hair clung to her face. Raindrops streamed down her skin, her breath visible in the cool night air. She looked lost, vulnerable, and completely out of place on the lonely stretch of road. David didn't hesitate. He pulled over, the tires splashing through a shallow puddle as he brought his car to a stop. Ignoring the rain that had already begun to seep into his clothes, he pushed open the door and stepped out. The chill of the night hit him instantly, but he barely noticed. His boots sank slightly into the soft, rain-soaked ground as he approached her, his concern growing with each step. "Are you okay? Can I help you?" he called out, his voice nearly lost beneath the roar of the downpour. The woman lifted her head, her lips trembling from the cold. Her long lashes stuck together, her eyes glistening under the dim streetlight. "The car just stopped," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "The engine won't start." David nodded, already shifting into problem-solving mode. "Let me take a look." He reached for the hood, popping it open as a rush of rainwater streamed down the edges. The engine bay was soaked, making it even harder to work. He leaned in, his fingers running over wet wires and metal components, searching for the problem. It wasn't anything major, just a loose connection, but in weather like this, even a minor issue could turn into a big one. As he worked, the rain didn't let up. His jacket quickly lost its ability to repel water, and soon, his shirt clung to his skin. Grease from the engine mixed with the rain, smudging his hands and arms, but he didn't care. His focus remained on fixing the car. The woman stood nearby, watching in quiet amazement as he worked with steady determination, completely unfazed by the cold or the mess. Minutes passed, and then finally, the engine roared to life. She gasped, her eyes lighting up with relief. "I can't believe it. It actually works." Her hands, which had been clutching her arms for warmth, fell to her sides in astonishment. David wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, only to smear oil across his skin. He glanced at his ruined clothes and let out a quiet chuckle. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a tissue, offering it to him with a concerned look. He Here, at least wipe your hands. David shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. It's fine, he said, letting the rain continue washing away the grime. Sometimes you've got to get a little dirty. She looked at him, both surprised and strangely impressed by his laid-back attitude. There was something about him, something steady, reliable. Someone who didn't hesitate to help without expecting anything in return. How can I thank you? She asked, genuine gratitude in her voice. David shrugged lightly, his expression warm but casual. No need, he said simply. Just, if one day you see someone else stranded in the rain, don't hesitate. She nodded slowly, his words lingering in her mind as she watched him walk back to his car. As he drove away, the sound of the rain filled the silence between them, but something told her she wouldn't forget this night or the man who had stopped when no one else did. The woman gently nodded her head, her eyes drifting off into the distance as if she were lost in thought. It seemed like something much deeper was going on in her mind, but she hesitated to put it into words. The rain continued to pour relentlessly, and the pale light from the street lamps glistened in the water droplets. Finally, she slowly lifted her head and, in a soft voice, said, "My name is Julia. I will never forget your kindness." David smiled faintly, without thinking about whether there was more behind those words. In his mind, he didn't see what he had done as anything significant. After all, what could be more natural than helping someone in need? He slightly tilted his head and waved his hand. "Be careful, Julia," he said simply. Then, he turned toward his truck, paying no mind to his soaked clothes as he walked slowly to the driver's seat. As he started the engine, he thought to himself, just an ordinary day. But in reality, it was far from being the most ordinary day of his life. Without even realizing it, that night, he had witnessed the beginning of something that would change the course of his life. When David arrived home, as soon as he opened the door, his Aunt Margaretha's cheerful voice greeted him. Seeing him soaking wet from the rain, she squinted her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest. "You can't come in like that, young man," she said, raising her eyebrows slightly. "Come on, take your clothes off at the door and head straight to the shower." David smiled and shook his head. He was used to his aunt's sweet but authoritative ways. As he took off his jacket and shirt, which were soaked through, he sighed. "Did you really think I shouldn't come into the house?" he joked. Margaretha rolled her eyes. "If you'd come in like that, the house would have flooded. Now go, take a hot shower before you catch a cold." David didn't argue. A few minutes under the hot water took the edge off his exhaustion. After putting on dry, comfortable clothes, he walked into the kitchen, where the delicious smells of food filled the air. Margaretha had, as usual, worked wonders in the kitchen. On the table was a steaming bowl of soup, freshly baked bread, and a vegetable casserole just out of the oven. David sat down at the table and took a deep breath. "Aunt, I don't know how I'd survive without your cooking," he said, bringing a spoonful of soup to his mouth. Margaretha smiled. "I'm glad to hear that. Then clean your plate, because there's dessert too." As David continued eating eagerly, his eyes caught the warm expression on his aunt's face. For a moment, he thought, and then the old idea resurfaced in his mind. "Aunt, if we could open a bakery, I'm sure we'd make a lot of money," he said eagerly. "The whole town would be after your pies." Margaretha laughed and shook her head slightly. "If I were young, maybe," she said. Then, showing her hands, she added, "But right now, there's neither staff nor money. And look at these hands. I'm not as fast as I used to be when kneading dough." David raised his eyebrows and looked at her jokingly. "With all this energy, you could outdo the 20-year-old women." Margaretha burst into laughter, her voice echoing through the kitchen. My sweet-talking nephew. Are you trying to flatter me so I'll wash the dishes for you?" David joined her laughter. "You really caught me there." David was working in the garage, just like always. He was bent over the engine, tightening screws with his greasy hands to fix the issue inside the motor. His mind was fully focused on the task when he heard a hum from outside. At first, he didn't pay much attention. Maybe it was a passing truck, but the sound was coming from a heavy, deep engine. It was getting closer and was now stopping right in front of the garage. When David lifted his head and looked outside through the door, he couldn't believe his eyes. A sleek, jet black, perfectly shiny luxury limousine was parked right in front of his shop. He wasn't used to seeing such a car in the small town. When the door opened, a man in a suit, looking sharp but very serious, stepped out. The man's face was expressionless, but his gaze was locked directly on David. As the man approached with slow steps, David wiped his oily hands on a rag and stood up. There was an odd formality in the stranger's posture. The man stopped directly in front of David and spoke in a confident voice. "Mr. Wagner, please come with us." David raised an eyebrow. "Where to?" The man smiled faintly, but his seriousness remained. "We have a surprise for you." David wanted to question what that meant, but his curiosity got the better of him. This wasn't a normal part of his everyday life, and such an opportunity might never come again. He glanced at the engine hood he still needed to close, then shrugged and shook his head. "All right," he said, and walked toward the open door of the limousine. Once inside, the softness of the leather seats and the faint scent of perfume made him feel like he was opening the door to an unfamiliar world. The limousine slowly began to move, heading out of the town. As David looked out the window, he watched the familiar streets disappear one by one. After a short while, the car arrived at the entrance of a large estate. Massive, ornate iron gates stood before them. When the driver pressed a button, the gates opened silently, and the limousine glided through. David's breath caught as he stared at the view before him. A massive mansion rose magnificently in front of him. Its windows were enormous, and the columns were elegantly adorned with intricate craftsmanship. The garden was meticulously designed, with fountains spraying water and flower beds lining the paths. When the car stopped, David took a deep breath. He had never seen a place so magnificent in his life. As the door opened, the man gave a slight bow and gestured inside. "Please, Mr. Wagner, they are waiting for you." David frowned. "Who is waiting for me?" The man simply smiled. "You'll find out once you go inside." Taking a deep breath, David walked toward the mansion's door. He didn't know what to expect, but there was no turning back now. As David ascended the grand staircase of the mansion, his footsteps echoed softly against the polished marble. The air carried a faint hint of expensive cologne and fresh flowers, blending seamlessly with the warm glow of the chandelier above. At the top of the stairs, an elegant figure stood waiting for him. It was Julia. She was dressed in a chic yet understated ensemble, the kind that spoke of quiet confidence rather than flashy wealth. The soft lighting reflected in her eyes, making them seem even brighter, as if this moment carried a weight that only she fully understood. When her lips curved into a faint but knowing smile, David's curiosity deepened. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of something almost reverent. He stopped a few steps below her, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change something between them. "When you helped me that night, you didn't know who I was," she continued, watching him carefully. "But I'm not just an ordinary person." David's brow furrowed slightly as he tried to make sense of her words. The weight in her voice, the hesitation, it wasn't just about gratitude. There was more to this. "My father," she said, her fingers lightly brushing against the smooth railing, "owns one of the largest automotive companies in the country." David froze. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. His hands instinctively tensed at his sides, his mind racing to catch up with the revelation. "What?" he asked, his voice quiet, but the single word carried all his disbelief. Julia tilted her head slightly, the corner of her lips lifting as she registered his reaction. She had expected surprise, but seeing it play out on his face amused her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "That night, your help didn't just fix my car," she continued, taking a step closer to him. "It reminded me of something. True kindness is the kind that's given without expecting anything in return." David remained silent, still absorbing the weight of her words. It had been just another rainy night to him, a simple act of helping someone in need. He hadn't thought much about who she was or what it meant. But to her, it had meant something more. "That's why I have an offer for you," Julia said, her expression turning more serious. "To work with us. At my father's company." David hesitated. The mansion, the wealth, the status, it all felt so far from the life he knew. His hands, still rough from years of hard work, clenched slightly. His own voice felt strange to him when he finally spoke. But I'm just a mechanic." Julia shook her head, her eyes unwavering. "No, you're more than that. And you deserve this opportunity." For a moment, David stood there, caught between disbelief and the unknown possibilities ahead. The rain-soaked night, the engine, The dirt under his nails, none of it had prepared him for this. And yet, here he was, standing at the top of a staircase that led to a future he had never imagined. David didn't know what to make of this offer. He had worked in a small garage his whole life. Big companies, management positions, worlds full of top-tier engineers. These things felt so far out of reach for him. But in Julia's gaze, there was sincerity. She genuinely wanted to reward him with an opportunity. "Why me?" he asked, still trying to make sense of whether this was real. Julia smiled gently. "Because we need people like you, David. Someone who truly knows what they're doing, who works with their hands, and who is sensitive to others." David took a deep breath. In front of him stood an opportunity that could completely change his life. On one side was the life he knew, the one he was accustomed to. On the other, an uncertain but exciting future. And maybe, for the first time, it was time to take a step toward that future. As soon as David returned home, he opened the door excitedly and rushed, out of breath, into the kitchen. The moment he entered, the delightful smell of cinnamon and baking apple pie greeted him. Margarethe was kneading dough with flour-covered hands at the kitchen counter. With sparkling eyes, David said, "Aunt, something incredible happened," almost without catching his breath. Margarethe looked up, raising her eyebrows as she observed him. "Calm down, young man. Take a deep breath first, then tell me." David pulled out a chair and sat down, trying to steady himself. "I was working in the garage. Then a limousine pulled up. A man got out, and he took me to a huge mansion," he said, speaking quickly with excitement. "And guess who I met? The woman I helped that night, Julia. Turns out, her father owns one of the biggest automotive companies in the country." Margarethe tilted her head slightly, clearly moved by what she had heard. "That's quite a coincidence," she said, listening intently. David continued without slowing down. "She offered me a job, Aunt. She wants me to work at their company. They want me to move, offering bigger opportunities and a better life." Margarethe placed her hands on her knees and paused for a moment, thinking. Her usual warm smile remained on her face, but there was a slight sadness in her eyes. "Oh, my dear child, that sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. "But I can't leave this town. I have my memories here, my flowers that I've planted in the garden for years, my friends. This is my home." For a moment, David's excitement faltered. He knew his aunt didn't want to leave her warm home, but the thought of leaving her side tugged at his heart. He thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up, and he smiled slightly. "Well, would you come with me to meet Julia? Maybe after you meet her, you'll change your mind." Margarethe looked at David's excitement and burst into a heartfelt laugh. "Ah, your persistence never changes," she said cheerfully. Then, shaking her head, she added, "Of course, why not? I'd be happy to meet the young lady." David's face brightened. Hope began to bloom inside him. Everything wasn't certain yet, but at least they could take a new step together with Margarethe. Who knows, maybe this unexpected opportunity would change not just his life, but both of theirs. The next morning, David and Margarethe set off for the mansion. As they drove, Margarethe glanced out the window and shook her head. "Do people living in such big houses really find happiness, I wonder?" she asked, her voice laced with a mix of curiosity and humor. David smiled. "I don't know yet, but we're about to find out." When the limousine arrived in front of the mansion, the massive gates opened, and Julia greeted them warmly with a genuine smile. "Welcome," she said sincerely. "It's so nice to see you here." Margarethe looked up and gazed at the mansion in admiration. "Well, this place isn't too bad," she muttered, her eyes wandering over the elegant columns and sprawling garden. But there was something David and Margarethe didn't know. Someone else was waiting for them inside. Richard von Stein, one of the legendary names in the business world, was walking through the grand hall, approaching the door with slow, deliberate steps. When Margarethe and Richard's eyes met, the room fell silent for a moment. Richard's eyes scanned Margarethe from head to toe, and a controlled smile appeared on his face. He was the epitome of a gentleman, exuding power and influence with his confident posture. However, Margarethe's energy and unique demeanor left him facing an unexpected situation. Margarethe crossed her arms over her chest and tilted her head slightly. "So, the famous Richard von Stein," she said, a subtle gleam of challenge in her eyes. Richard smiled faintly. "Ms. Margarethe, it's a great pleasure to see such a refined lady here." Margaretti squinted her eyes, a mischievous smile forming on her lips. Are you trying to impress me by calling me refined, Mr. von Stein? Julia and David exchanged astonished glances. They hadn't expected this encounter to turn into a verbal chess game so quickly. Richard slightly bowed, maintaining his smile. Maybe. Throughout the day, Margaretti and Richard's banter and playful exchanges lightened the heavy atmosphere of the mansion. The two strong personalities responded to each other with witty remarks, and the room was filled with laughter. During dinner, David quietly leaned toward his aunt. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, and his voice was in a whisper. "Aunt, what's going on?" Margaretti glanced at him from the corner of her eye, a mischievous smile playing at the corners of her lips. She gently placed her fork down and crossed her arms over her chest, leaning slightly forward. "What's the matter?" she asked with a mocking expression. "Can't I like someone?" David's eyes widened. "What?" Margaretti tilted her chin slightly upward and looked toward Richard. "Nice guy, and playful too." David tried to stifle his laughter, but failed. He rolled his eyes. "Aunt, what are you saying?" Margaretti looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Do you think I'm too old, David?" she said with a challenging tone. "I have needs too." Upon hearing this, both Julia and David froze, their faces instantly going stiff. They exchanged glances before looking back at Margaretti, both in shock. Margaretti, however, acted as if nothing had happened. With a confident air, she picked up her fork and walked briskly toward Richard. The rest of the group stood there, staring, trying to process what had just happened. After the meal, Margaretti lightly touched David's shoulder and turned her eyes to him. "All right, son, you should take this job," she said with a determined voice. "And who knows, maybe I'll consider leaving this town for a little while myself." David, still stunned, smiled faintly. "So you're accepting?" Margaretti glanced toward Richard, sending him a subtle smile. Then, she tilted her head toward David and raised her eyebrows slightly. "I suppose there could be some advantages to moving," she said with a wink. David was laughing and shaking his head in disbelief. Julia, turning to her father, raised her eyebrows slightly. Richard, holding his glass, gently raised it and responded with nothing but a mysterious smile. When David started his new job, his skills were quickly noticed. The abilities he had gained in a small garage were standing out even in a large automotive company. His knowledge of machines, practical intelligence, and hard work soon caught the attention of the managers. They realized that he wasn't just a mechanic, but someone with a mind sharp enough to compete with engineers. But the biggest surprise in David's life was hidden in Julia's gaze. She had noticed something in him. His determination, honesty, and warmth were qualities not often found in the people around her. And David found himself living a life filled with opportunities he had never even dreamed of. In their new home, Margaretti carefully transformed it into a true home. She thought of every detail, even adding a small vegetable corner to the garden. David felt reassured every time he saw her still so happy. But life, it seemed, held even more surprises than they had planned. One day, when the doorbell rang, David instinctively opened the door and found Richard von Stein standing there, holding fresh flowers. Even in his sharp suit, he had the excitement of a young man. "Is Margaretti here?" he asked with a slight smile. David, still surprised, opened the door and invited him in. When Richard saw Margaretti, he extended the flowers to her. Margaretti smiled as she took the flowers and smelled them. "Mr. von Stein, you're spoiling me," she said with a teasing voice. Richard tilted his head slightly and looked at her. "We've both been alone for a long time, Margaretti," he said gently. "But I would like you to be the one I find joy in for the rest of my life." A mix of surprise and a hint of a blush appeared on Margaretti's face. "Are you proposing to me?" Richard nodded slightly. "Yes, if you accept." David and Julia quietly watched the moment from the corner of the room. David felt both proud and surprised to see his aunt maintain her confidence even in the presence of such a powerful man. Margaretti took a deep breath, then nodded slightly. "I guess there are more advantages to moving than I thought," she said, winking. David and Julia still stood in shock, but it was clear there was a real connection between Margaretti and Richard. And so, in the grand mansion's garden, a simple yet beautiful wedding was held. Old friends and new family members gathered in the flower-decorated garden. As David watched his aunt dance with Richard in her white dress, he shook his head with a smile. When she came to him, He joked, "Aunt, I didn't leave you, but you've left me." Margarethe laughed and gently touched David's cheek. "You've grown into such a big man. It's time to live your own life," she said. But then, she leaned in quietly and added, "But don't worry, I'll always cook for you and bring you food." David smiled as a warm feeling filled him. He thought about how their lives had changed so suddenly and shook his head. A small act of kindness on a rainy night had led them to happiness they never could have imagined. Sometimes, kindness doesn't just return to you. It can also lead you to an unexpected happiness. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe and like. See you in the next stories.